It is August 31st, 2022. So we are officially at the 253rd anniversary of the 1769 Lexington spinning match, spinning protest, I like to call it. I was the curator of the exhibition, Something Must Be Done, Women of Lexington. I am very excited to see what happens next, to see the women's monument that's going to kind of fill in that space. And I'm the assistant curator at the Scottish Rite Masonic Museum and Library in Lexington.
So Stacey, you curated the Something Must Be Done exhibit here at Buckman Tavern. How did you come up with the name Something Must Be Done?
Ooh, that was a good moment. We had a great exhibit team working on the project. Erica McAvoy, who was the executive director of the Historical Society at the time, Elizabeth Mubarak, who was the archivist, myself, Lauren Kennedy, who many of you probably know, she's on the steering LexSeeHer and has been involved in the community in a lot of different ways, including banners, and she was working as the exhibit designer. And then Rick Beyer, who is a wonderful, got to be the token man, exhibit writer, plus Emily Murphy, who did the exhibit research. So we're having a meeting. I don't remember if everyone was there. I think Rick called in from Chicago, and we're all looking over some documents. And we were playing around with a few different titles. Daughters of Liberty was one of them. And we realized that Abigail Harrington realized what was going on, or at least realized there was a commotion going on outside of her house, essentially on the green, on the common, and went in and woke up her son and said, you know, the soldiers are here. Something must be done. We have to do something. And it was just a lightning bolt moment. You know, we all looked at each other and said, oh, that's perfect for a title. It works in 1775, the morning of the battle. It works in 1769 for the spinning bee. It works in 2019 for the Women's March. It's just this idea of there's an injustice or there's something that isn't going the way that you want it to go. Stand up and do something about it.
In the exhibit, there's a good portion of space that focuses on the 1769 spinning protest. It's certainly not something, I literally majored in American history in college. Never heard of the spinning protest. How did you know about it?
It's a really interesting thing because, you know, the Historical Society has done work on other sort of less well-known things like the Lexington tea burning, you know, in comparison to something like the Boston Tea Party. It's not as well-known. But this wasn't, the spinning match in Lexington wasn't something that, you know, there was one famous example and then smaller examples around. It was something that had happened in this town and also happened in a lot of other towns. So we were really lucky because we knew it had happened through some of our, you know, secondary sources. And Emily Murphy had done an amazing job with research. She was able to look at the newspaper records, try to figure out who was there that day, try to figure out, you know, why it wasn't at the minister's house. It was often the case to have it at the minister's house. You know, it was a very public kind of thing, and the minister and the minister's wife support it. But Reverend Clark lives about a third of a mile down the street, and the Harringtons are right on the green. So we think that's part of why, that could have been the reason why Anna Harrington offered to host it, because it's a much more public space. You know, it's not tucked away down the road at the minister's house where you're not as close to the center of town and the center of politics and commerce and ideas. So Emily's research really helped flesh that out. She discovered some really exciting things about the way it was done. For example, there were 45 women who were selected for the event. And as you point out, you know, in a town like Lexington, where you've only got about 900 people or so at the time, that's a pretty good chunk of women, you know. And if you think some are too old and some are too young, you know, to do this kind of thing, having 45 women was interesting and significant, because the number 45 was often used by the Sons of Liberty and other revolutionary actors as a symbol of rebellion from the king. There was James Wilkes, who was someone who written a journal, or had a journal in England, and Wilkes in 45 kind of became a byword for the Sons of Liberty and other revolutionary individuals. So Emily thinks that the 45 women selected was not totally by accident, that there was definitely some strategic planning around the event. And I think that's, you know, the timing of it is really interesting too. It's 1769, 14 miles from Boston. So we're at a time where if you want something that's nice and new and imported and somebody else made it for you, you can probably get it, whether it's a shop in town or whether you're going into Boston for trade and to buy things. So the idea of actually making homespun just wasn't that common anymore. Not every little girl learned how to spin or learned how to make clothing or fabric. So the idea of actually taking kind of a traditional handicraft that was used for early industry in New England, using that as a political protest, basically talking to people like Captain Parker, who was a wheelwright and made a lot of spinning wheels, a market increase. I think Sarah McDonough had looked up some research, and I think it was around 700% increase around this time in creating spinning wheels, which indicates, at least partially, that they hadn't been using as many spinning wheels before that, that it kind of dropped off as people were buying ready-made clothing and things like that as access increased. But that there was this movement to kind of bring it back in order to create a protest moment. So seeing Parker's records and seeing the increase and just the quantities of spinning wheels he was turning out, you do have to wonder too what he was thinking. It's like, okay, what are they up to? So I think it really indicates a lot of organization, whether Anna Harrington was heading it up and organizing everything, or whether she just offered her lawn as a really good publicly visible location. There was definitely a lot of organization around the event. There were other communities that were doing these spinning matches and spinning bees, so there was kind of a formula that they could follow and kind of customize it for their own community. Around this time period, and Emily Murphy has the best data on this and wrote a great white paper on it, around the late 1760s, it was like 2 or 3 years, like 1768 to like 1770, where there was just this rash of spinning matches all over the place. As people were trying to figure out, how do we mark our displeasure, basically? How do we say we're not okay with these taxes, we're not okay with the lack of ability to have a say in where the tax money goes? How do we say something about that? How do we do something about that? It ties it back to something must be done. This is what they thought was a good way to show we're not reliant on British imports. We don't have to be. We can be self-sustaining. And whether or not that's practical is another question. Whether or not, everybody at the spinning bee were probably, younger women who didn't have as many requirements outside of, had the ability to come to this event. Whether or not they actually would have buckled down and started producing clothing for themselves and everyone else had, some of these rules and laws not been repealed. It's an interesting question, but it definitely worked as a moment, as a protest and a method of saying we can be independent.
How did you think about object selection to convey what it means to have a spinning protest event?
Well, one of the things we knew we wanted to do from the start was actually have at least one spinning bee in the room. Because I think one of the things that it was really, we'll never know unless, engraving that we're not aware of or painting that we're not aware of or sketches something shows up of that event. We have to kind of use our imagination to figure out what it looks like. But if you figure that there were 45 women on spinning wheels, there's different sizes of wheels depending on what you're doing, but even assuming kind of the smallest spinning flax wheel, 45 wheels on a less than an acre plot of land it's a lot of spinning wheels. So that was something we really wanted to try to help people visualize. We have 2 wheels in the exhibit, one that holds labels, holds more information about books and 45 and other things. And we had a spinning wheel that visitors to the exhibition could sit and actually pump the foot pedal and just try to get a sense of what that felt like. I thought that was a really interesting way to approach it because, textiles are tricky. We don't have a lot of original textiles. The historical society does not, because things get made over, things get reused. And so that part of that was not really having access to really good period textiles to show what are the kinds of things that they may have been, planning to make all this yarn they're producing at the event. But having the spinning wheels, having 2 particularly, having a large one and a small one, so people can start to visualize 2 wheels in, this much space. Okay, and then, 45 wheels, which we were lucky enough to work with LexSeeHer, and then when that actually happened a couple times, where you actually had, all these women, it really gave more of that visual impact. And, a lot of that I think is what the goal was, is to have very visual impact and for people to see them doing it. And so, the more spinning wheels, the better, basically. Which is ironic because, the Historical Society has a lot more spinning wheels. Some in the houses, some in storage. But it was nice to at least be able to take out 2 and really focus on those. And then the rest we just kind of filled in with things. In that room we also talked about the Lexington tea burnings. We were able to fill that in with some of the tea accoutrement that we had. We also have a really beautiful textile that we use to talk about any kind of boycott, basically. If you're saying, okay, I'm not going to buy British cloth, or I'm not going to buy anything British, then breaking that down and thinking, okay, if you're going to make a sampler, though, where do you get the fabric for it? Where do you get the linen ground for it? Where do you get the steel needles? Where do you get all your materials if you're not going to buy them from the place you've always bought them from? So it was also a nice way to think about modern protests, or the more recent protests where boycotting has become something that people do to kind of vote with their wallets and show, okay, we don't need your stuff. But the question of, what do you do instead? Do you fill it in? Is there an alternate locally or not? We're lucky in 2022 that we can, if we're mad at Starbucks, we can go to Dunkin'. It's not a problem, but we have options. But in 1769, and you want to make that sampler, if you don't have linen, you have to make a choice to either make it yourself or go against what you say you're trying to do and showing your independence against British goods.
So Meredith Bergman visited the society and the exhibit that you curated before she submitted her proposal to LexSeeHer. And she said she was really inspired by what she saw. And as we now know, the monument is very much literally based on this historic event of the spinning. So the plaza is a round spinning wheel shape. And then we see Anna Harrington, or a representative of someone at that event. And then there's a spinning wheel at the top of the arch. So the exhibit is going to live on in this way forever. When you first saw the design and you saw how the spinning event was carried forward, what were some of your thoughts as the person who put this together?
I think it was really wonderful because that was one of the things that we tried to focus on. This event that people didn't know a lot about. We actually did the first one on the 250th anniversary on August 31st, 2019. And that was before the exhibition was open, before LexSeeHer had formed as a group. So our goals back then were fairly simple. It was mostly just letting people know that this event had happened, and it happened in our town, in addition to, the reason why all the visitors come in the summer. That there were other important events that happened, and that in this case, for example, was really driven by the women of the town. So the idea of having that be something that carries on and have it be sort of a symbol maybe of some of the independence and the activism that we see in Lexington. I think that really made me feel good. It made me feel like that story is out there. It's anything that takes place outside of a historic house, in the great outdoors. It's a little harder to keep a permanent reminder of it or a permanent interpretation of it. So having something that's out here that's going to last, to be around for a long time, that references that event and acknowledges all the women who took part was really wonderful.
One thing that you really work closely on is trying to reinterpret and understand everything we know so far about the 1700s, but with greater attention to what Black women's lives were like here in Lexington. And I'm wondering, what are your thoughts when you think about the spinning event? We don't have a list of who attended, but what are some ways that Black women may have participated?
So much of what we said about who was there is speculation. It's sort of trying to figure out what is the socioeconomic status, what color, what age are the individuals participating. And it's difficult to tell from the primary sources. The newspapers just refer to, the ladies in Lexington, that kind of thing. So there's no specifics at all. I think it would be interesting if we were ever able to figure out beyond, Anna Harrington, who we know was there because she hosted it, if we could ever figure out beyond that what families were involved, because that would help us understand, there were a lot of families in Lexington who had enslaved people living with them. And based on the timing, it'd be nice to figure out, how much could or would someone like a Margaret Tulip or someone who was in town at the time been involved. My inclination is to think, and it's totally personal, is to think that if someone were enslaved in a household of a woman who was participating, that there might be, some help, certainly beforehand, getting things ready, getting all the, trying to create a lot of skeins of yarn in a very short time. So they're probably getting baskets of cotton and wool and things getting ready. Things have to be carded in advance to get them actually ready. You don't just walk up and put the lamb's wool directly on the spinning wheel. You have to prepare things a lot. And to be honest, a lot of the harder, dirtier, a little messier work was the kind of thing that typically enslaved people would do in a household. So my guess is that if there were families who had enslaved women living with them or enslaved men, some of the preparation work for the spinning event probably would have fallen to those people. And, they were enslaved. So agency is a big question there. Is that something that, someone who had to help with that would have wanted to do? Would they have been in support of that? Or would they have just thought, this is, something that doesn't concern me, that's not really concerning work? So I think that's interesting because we have such a gray area around even the more documented, white women who were there, and we still don't know. So the idea of where Black women in Lexington may have or may have not fit into this event is really fascinating, and I don't know the kind of documentation that we could actually find to prove anything there. But like most historians, it's certainly compelling. It's a really great mystery to see if we can figure out. We've learned so much about Margaret Tulip in the last few years. Leslie Masson's work and other people's work has just been absolutely amazing. And when we started the exhibition, we had 200 words on her, and now you could write a book easily. I'm surprised Leslie hasn't started one yet. So the idea that, we don't know, but there's ideas. We can use logic to try to figure out the kind of thing that might be, might have happened, or the kind of task that an enslaved Black woman or a free Black woman could have helped with. And then we can hope that as we look further into things, we may find more information and figure something out someday about what roles were being held by the women in town.
This is fantastic. Thank you so much for the exhibit and for sharing.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jessie. I've said it before and I'll say it a million times. We created this exhibition. It was up for a few years during the pandemic, of course. So we were really limited in some ways by who could see it. And even in a normal year, the society only sees 20,000 visitors. So there's a limit on how many people can actually physically go through the exhibition. But the fact that it was picked up, the ideas, the women's stories, the need for further research, the need for an actual permanent monument was so effectively, competently, I can think of a million, positive compliments there, but that it was picked up and carried forward so well by the LexSeeHer community, by the steering committee, the advisory board, and all of the people who've been involved.